Okay, so today we're basically going to do a little bit of a preview of some of the stuff that I'm working on for my online DAX class that's sort of in development. You've already seen a couple, bits and pieces from it. One of the pieces of feedback we got, and by the way, thanks very much for all the people that provided feedback, was that the stuff that we showed was great, but people wanted a bit more of some more introductory material to get more of a sense of like, all right, well, wait, what do we mean when we say DAX? Go through some terminology, help us understand a bit more the very, very simple things before you dive into some sort of methodology. So that's sort of what we're going to be talking about today. We're basically going to be trying to come to a working definition of both what is DAX and what is a measure. Now, I'm sure most folks in this room have used DAX quite a bit, and when they use DAX, they wrote measures. So on the one hand, everybody knows what DAX is and everybody knows what a measure is, but I bet if I force you to give me a definition and say, well, all right, you tell me what do you think it is, there'd be a fair amount of hemming and hawing because, I know one when I see one, but I don't quite know what to call it or how to describe it. So we're going to go into that. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to pop over here, and we're going to start with a simple definition. What is DAX? DAX is a querying language that builds summary tables. Period. Full stop. End of statement. That is what the DAX engine was built to do. That's what it does very effectively. You could do a few other things with it, but generally you don't. Really, DAX builds summary tables, right? What do we mean by that? Well, so we're going to gather large amounts of fine-grained data into physical tables in our data model, right? We're going to use the M language and Power Query to go reach out to SQL databases or to Excel files or to Access databases, grab a bunch of data, pull it together, and then the DAX language, once that data has been pulled together, is going to summarize it very quickly. So we might have a physical table, like maybe a sales table, that's got 13 million rows in it. The job of the DAX engine is to create a summary in less than a second. So nobody cares about all 13 million rows, but they might want to see a summarization that says, I don't know, what is sales by region or something like that. So it'll create that summary table very, very quickly. That is what DAX was designed to do. So let's talk about how it fits into Power BI.
Mr. Brian, I don't know if you're willing to share your video, but everybody would love to see your hat. I know Chris.
Oh, all right. Hold on. Un moment. Okay.
Yes.
If I start doing something untoward, please remind me that I'm on camera. Thank you very much. So how does DAX fit into Power BI? The job of DAX within Power BI is to create the numbers that Power BI is going to turn into charts and graphs, right? So if you've got data in several different source systems, like maybe a SQL database or Excel file, you will use the M engine, which is this edit queries button, to go figure out how to load data into your data model, right? That's the job of the M engine. Every night, it's going to go reach out to these source systems and load data into your data model. That's the data that sits in your cache, right? The job of the DAX engine is to, on demand, create summarizations of this data, right? So it's going to create these summarizations that Power BI will then draw as any number of visuals. So every time you have a visual in Power BI, there's a summary table behind it, which is something that the DAX engine has built from the data model, right? That's where DAX fits into this. Some folks that are super duper astute, they might look at this and say, oh, wait, that's actually a summary table. I should say it's a table visual. So if I come over here to the visuals pane, like notice I've clicked on table right there. Are you saying that this table right here, that if I click this button, that is a summary table? Well, no. Summary table is the data that gets drawn into any number of visuals. Table visuals are one of those visuals. The good thing about this table visual is that the summary table behind it happens to look just like the end result of it, which is why I sort of show it that way, right? So just to reiterate, let me go ahead and twirl this closed. Actually, I'll reiterate in a second. Let's pivot for a second. Speaking of pivot, pivot tables. For folks who have not worked a whole bunch with Power BI, you may be saying to yourself, Brian, this sounds a little bit like a pivot table. And indeed, the two concepts are pretty strongly related. So with a pivot table, you start with detailed data that you load into some range in your Excel workbook, right? You turn it into a pivot table, and then you get these pivot table controls where you say, I want to see sale amount and margin amount broken down by year and product category. And then the pivot table quickly summarizes your data for you. It's a very similar idea, right? It takes detailed information and it summarizes it on demand. And just like with a pivot table, it allows you to very quickly pivot things and slice things. So it will redraw the pivot table on demand. Okay. So why not just use a pivot table? Why use DAX? Well, several reasons. DAX is going to be able to work on much bigger sets of data, like considerably bigger sets of data. So rather than being constrained by a million rows and Excel kind of even choking on that, Power BI will work with 20, 30, 40 million rows and not really have a problem. Also, Power BI's, or I should say DAX, is going to be able to handle more complex summarizations. With a pivot table, you could take a column like sale amount and margin amount, and you could take the sum of it, you could take the average of it. But if you want to do something like year-over-year growth, you can't really do that with a pivot table. DAX will let you do those sort of on-demand aggregations. So I said I was going to revisit this concept, and I want to hit it once or twice because I think it's pretty darn important. Every visual in Power BI has a summary table behind it, which is the result of a summary query. So if I've got this page right here, and we imagine these actual visualizations where I've got this line chart and I've got this stacked column chart, and I've got these two cards right here. Behind every single one of these visuals is a summary table that is the data that is being drawn as these different visuals, right? So for this line chart, where I've got sales by year and quarter, sure enough, I've got a summary table with sales by year and quarter. For the card, where I've just got total sales, well, sure enough, I have a very boring summary table where I've just got total sales. And down here, where I've got sales by city and category, well, sure enough, the summary table is going to have sales by city and category. And what's important to note is when I interact with the report by, like, saying, clicking on walk up as opposed to sit down, right? The visuals change, but the way that the visuals change is, right, Power BI will issue a series of new summary queries that say, I need new summarizations. I need this, but for walk up. I need this, but for walk up. I need this, but for walk up. And then the DAX engine says, no problem. It goes ahead, it runs those summary queries, and within no time at all, I mean, you can see how fast it is, right? Really incredibly fast. The DAX engine generates these new summary tables, which Power BI then takes and draws as visualizations. Okay. I'm going to pause for a second. Are there any questions about that? Anything show up in the Q&A window that shouldn't wait till the end?
Let me check it out.
Anybody want to know about the long?
Just comments. Nope.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So those are summary tables. Where do these summary tables come from? Well, that would be summary queries, right? So every time you have a visual, like maybe I've got this matrix down here, right? You are going to start with the Power BI interface where you design which visual you want. You say, I want this matrix. I want to put city on rows. I want to put category on columns. And in the value section, I want total sales and margin percent. As soon as you do that, right, Power BI creates the tile, but then it issues a summary query that says, hey, this person wants to see total sales and margin percentage broken down by city and category. So you have to go tell me what is total sales and margin percentage broken down by city and category. And that request looks like this. This is what the DAX query would be that gets sent to the DAX engine, right? It says summarize columns. Go build me a summary where we break down all the combinations of city and category. And for each one, we get total sales, which we're going to call total sales, right? And we're going to get margin percent, which the name of the column for will be margin percent, right? So this request immediately gets sent off to the DAX engine. DAX says no problem within, a very short period of time, way less than a second. The DAX engine sends back a summary table that looks maybe something like this, where we've got total sales and margin percent, again, broken down by city and category. So once Power BI gets this summary table, it is able to redraw it as this visual right here, right? And so it's able to take the request, process it, create data. The DAX engine creates the data that Power BI then draws. What's meaningful is as soon as a user interacts with the report, we need to redraw the visual to reflect that interaction. And what that means is Power BI is going to issue a new summary query. So if I come down here and click on 2017, notice a new summary query gets generated. This time with this line right here where it says year is in 2017, or I could change it to be. Go ahead.
Hey, Brian, is there a way to see this summary table, or did you write this out?
So there are some ways to do it. You end up using DAX Studio to do it. Within Power BI, no. The table visual is as close as you get to actually seeing the summary table. Without going into too much of diversion, I can head up here. Oh gosh, where is it? They moved everything. Somewhere in here is the performance analyzer. I'll go turn this on. I'm going to start recording, right? Now, notice when I click on food, all of the visuals, right, have new queries associated with them. So like if I go to, I don't care about the slicer, let's go to total sales by state. Notice here the performance analyzer tells us how fast this thing executed, but it also says copy query right here. So I can take this, right, and I can drop it in something like DAX Studio, right? And I think this is actually connected to the wrong model, so there's a good chance this won't work. And what you'll see is this is a bit more complicated than the version that I wrote, right? But assuming, I wonder if these things are close enough that this will work. Let me try it. I'm going to go highlight this code. Technically, I'm pointed at a different data set, right? Let's go ahead and run it and see if it works. Hey, there we go, right? So there is the summarization as requested by this is the summary query. So this summary query is a bit more complicated than the one that I wrote, right? The one that I wrote looks like this. This is what they used to look like back in the days of yore when they were a lot simpler. But the concept is the same, right? You interact with the report. DAX issues a new summary query. Start by looking at this. This is sort of a simplified version of it. If you want to look at the real thing, you could go use the performance analyzer to scoop it up, right? And then you can drop it in a tool like DAX Studio, and you can actually see the result of this summary query as a summary table. This is what the Power BI engine would take and draw. Specifically, I believe that is this guy right down here, which is why I think we should get 4.7 million and 52 million. Let's see, is that right? Yeah, 4.7 million, and what did I say for Washington? Oh, just around 2 million. So, yep, that looks about right. Does that answer the question? I'm asking into space as if I could see the screen right now. Let's see.
I believe you did. You're good.
Rock and roll. Okay, super cool, super cool. Okay, so that was a bit of a diversion, but hopefully a fun one, right? Now, I think I was in the middle of my spiel here, and I spent a lot of time building this guy. I hope you guys like this. Every time you interact with the report, right? Like if I click on beverage right here, right? The summary query gets rewritten to include a filter for beverage, like, hey, right there, there's that filter for beverage. The DAX engine, almost immediately, way less than a second, goes ahead and generates the summary table, which then Power BI takes and draws as any number of visuals, right? So, what does DAX do? Why does it exist in Power BI? Well, that's what it does, and that's how it does it, okay? Does that make sense so far? Any other questions? Anybody want to ask me to write this by hand? Because I'm not going to do it.
We got one question. Can you speak to how filters are applied or party of filters being applied?
Could you repeat that question one more time?
How can you speak to how filters are applied?
Sure. Yeah. So anytime you interact with a report, right? So
plus 15105663613 is now exiting.
All right. If you've got a filter right here, and it's like anytime you interact with a report, be it through filters like slicer filters like this, like if I click on this, notice it's going to add a line to the summary query, right? In the real version, it'll be a little bit more complicated than this, but the short version, it says it's going to add a filter right there where year is in 2017. So if I control click on 2016, it says year is either 2016 or 2017. Now that happens with slicers. That also happens with cross filtering. So if I click on Washington, right, as you might expect, the visual down here changes. Well, how does the visual change? When I click on Washington, the summary query gets rewritten to include a filter for state is in this list of states. There's Washington. I could also control click on Oregon, and now it's in Washington or Oregon. But let's just go back to looking at Washington. The DAX engine gets the summary query, says, you got it, boss. I'm going to go ahead and rerun this query and generate a summary table reflecting that choice, and that gets drawn down here. And the same thing is true. The same thing is true for anything over here on the filters pane, right? So if I come over here and let's see, do I have anything good on here? Filters on this page, year. Yeah, there we go. That'll work. If I click on 2017, it does the exact same thing, right? So even though these are three different things, and the end user has three different experiences between using filters in the filters pane, or using slicers, or using cross filtering, the end result is the same, right? It just changes how the summary query is written out, which then, of course, acts as a filter within the summarization. So the summary table is different, and the visual reflects the choice. To the person out there that asked that question, did I answer that pretty well, or did I dodge it?
I think you got it, Brian.
Nailed it. Okay. Or I went on for so long that they said, forget it. He's not going to get to the answer anyways.
I'm going to wait to ask questions now until the end of it to stop derailing you, but keep going.
Okay. Okay. So those are summary queries, which then generate summary tables, which Power BI then draws. Again, so here, this is in Power BI, right? When you write stuff, Power BI writes this, right? Sends it off to the DAX engine, which is not the same thing as Power BI. The DAX engine, or the SQL Server Analysis Services Engine is the official name, lives off elsewhere on your computer. It knows Power BI exists, but they're just buddies. You know, it's not the same thing. It gets the request, creates a summary table, and then draws it. Okay, so within a summary table, there are two major sections that we care about. In fact, not two major. There are two sections, right? There's basically two kinds of columns. You can have what we could call category columns, which create a breakdown of all the combination of categories you want to ask about, right? So here in this particular summary table, we're asking a variety of questions, but we're asking them by city and category. These over here, these are the category columns. We get the combinations of city and category, all the combinations of beverage in the cities that we're looking at. And for each one of those combinations, we get these metrics right here, which are what make up the measure columns, right? So here we have the categories, and these measures answer a question for every single row. So what is total sales for Beaverton Beverages? What is total sales for Camas Food? What is margin percentage for Vancouver Food, right? These are not creating categories. These are actually answering a particular business question. You can think of these as sort of like smart aggregators. If there's any mathematicians in the room, yeah, we're sort of messing with the definition of aggregator just a little bit, but that's a good way to start thinking about it. Thinking about them as smart aggregators. In fact, we're going to get to a better definition in a second. Okay, so I was told we're going to pause on questions till the end. Therefore, I'm going to plow through to the next half of the presentation. I'm going to minimize that. Oops, pop over to what is a measure? Oops, I'm on the wrong slide. Okay, so before we were looking at what is DAX, and I think we answered that pretty well. What is a measure? Well, I'm going to start by showing you a problem that a measure solves. The measure solves a couple problems. This is one of them. So imagine, if you will, this report in Excel. Now, normally it won't be quite this obvious what the problem is, but just go with me for a second. So here we have a report written in Excel. I've gone ahead and grabbed a screenshot for it, right? And we have for the 3 states that we sell in, Oregon, Washington, and California, we've got for the last 3 years, we've got the sales, our base goal, our reach goal, and our dollars to goal. How close are we to our goal? And right now at this company, everybody is freaking out. Everybody's freaking out because last year, for every single one of our states, we were exceeding our goal. We were up, you know, $100,000, $300,000, almost $500,000 over our goal. But this year, we're consistently performing under our goal, right? So everybody at this company is freaking out. But some of you may be noticing there's a reason maybe people shouldn't be freaking out. So what is that reason? Well, wait a minute. Dollars to goal. Are we talking about our sales dollars to our base goal or to our reach goal? And if we poke inside the actual definition of these formulas, right, what we will see is for the current year, right, we are comparing against our reach goal, which is supposed to be harder to obtain, right? And last year we were comparing against our base goal, which is supposed to be easier to obtain. In fact, if you were to actually consistently compare either reach to reach or goal to goal, you would find that this year we're actually doing better than last year, right? So it's not that the performance of the business has decreased. The problem that we have is that we have a single business question, dollar to goal, that is being allowed to be answered several ways within a single report. Now, normally you won't see this problem quite so obviously, but you'd be surprised. And a lot of times, especially if you have multiple tables across multiple worksheets, on one worksheet, it'll be a particular question will be defined one way. On another worksheet, it'll be defined a different way. Occasionally, we even have like what we had here 2 years back, right? Where Oregon and California are comparing against the, what is that? The reach goal, and Washington's compared against the base goal. So even within a table, we can't get consistency. So with Excel, I mean, Excel makes exceptions super duper easy, which sounds good, but it's really kind of bad because that means if you've got one particular business question, you can answer it 1,000 different ways, right? So part of the idea with a measure, among other things, is to avoid this problem, to say if we've got a business question like what is dollar to goal, we're going to define how you answer it in exactly one place. That way, whenever you see dollar to goal in your report, you know it's always being calculated the same way, so that if you want to compare two numbers, you know that it's a meaningful comparison, right? So here I'm tempted to compare this value to this value, but that doesn't really mean anything. It's apples to oranges. Measures avoid that particular problem. You could think of it a bit like a reusable formula, okay? Speaking of ways to think about it, we're going to look at some definitions for measures. In fact, we're going to look at 3 of them. So why 3? The short answer is that they're all correct, right? And you can't really squeeze all 3 definitions into one big long sentence, because the reality is, depending on your job or how you fit into the Power BI and DAX universe, you'll be looking at measures different ways. And for each one of these sort of personas, you can have a definition for DAX that is correct that may not make sense to the other folks, okay? So what are these definitions? Well, one definition of a measure, but this is something that a report author, somebody that builds report, they don't write the DAX, they just use it to drag and drop into visuals. They might say measures are business questions, right? So if you've got a measure, you just drag it into a table, and then for every single row of the table, you get the answer. So if we've got this table down here, we dragged in total sales, and it's just a question. What is total sales? And I get the answer, total sales for this, for Beverages Oregon and Food in Washington, et cetera, right? That's a pretty good definition, but there's another definition. If you're new to DAX, but you're not avoiding it, you're just new to it, you might think of measures as the official instructions for answering a particular business question. This solves the problem we had a second ago, such that if you have an entire big, long report, you can ensure that if you have a business question like what is total sales, that you answer it consistently across the report, both within tables, which is really good, but also across tables and across pages, right? That's a pretty meaningful definition. This means that if I need to update the instructions for how to answer a particular business question, like what is total sales, I can just open that measure up, change a few lines of code, and then it's fixed everywhere that I'm using it. Also a correct definition, also a good definition, but there's one more definition. And I bet these first 2 make a good amount of sense to folks in the room. This third one probably doesn't, and that's okay. I'm going to walk you through it. Hopefully by the end, you get most of it, right? So if you're a seasoned DAX developer, here's how you might think about a measure. A measure executes a DAX sub-expression under a revised set of filters, or a filter context, right? Sub-expression because it's going to get evaluated as part of a larger DAX summary query, and under a revised set of filters because we need to update the filters to look at the categories of that row so the numbers are different. Whew, that's a mouthful. Okay, so we're going to go through examples of all of these. Let's just pause on these little sub-definitions right there. We'll get back to them in a second, okay? Let's start with the definition for a report author. Measures are business questions. I don't care where they came from. I don't know how they got built. I just see them and I drag them into tables, right? So if I've got this table right here, I could come over here to my fields. I could open up my measures table, and I'm going to go get total sales. I just drag it into this visual, and boom, I get total sales for every single row combination. I take that same question, drag it in here, and boom, I get total sales for every single year and state combination. I can drag it down here and get the exact same result. And even when I click on slicers, it still correctly answers the question. How? Who cares? It doesn't matter. From my point of view as a report author, I don't know where these things came from. I just know that these are my questions that I can drag into visuals to get answers for, right? So let's talk about how a DAX novice might view a measure. They might say that measures are the official instructions for answering a particular business question, right? So if we've got a business question like what is total sales, or I'm going to call it total sales R, but what is total sales? We could define how you answer that question in one and only one place. The way we answer the question, what is total sales alternative, is we take the sum X over this table. For every row, we calculate the price and we sum it up. Now, this isn't a course on how to write DAX. Don't worry too much about this, other than to note that these are the instructions for answering that particular question right there. So this is the instructions for answering what is total sales. And regardless of where I ask it, be it this visual right here, this visual right here, this visual right here, or any of those same visuals under a different set of slicers, it doesn't matter. I always answer the question the exact same way, right? So let's see, and I get some weird answers, but don't worry about that. The reason we have weird answers is if you look at the definition for this particular measure, total sales, well, we're summing up the price column in the sales table. We should probably be summing up the sale amount column. Now, in Excel, if you were to do this, you would have to go through every single cell and fix the definition of every single cell, fix all those formulas. That could take forever. With DAX, I could just come over here to that measure, total sales alt. Hey, there's the measure, right? Hey, here's the official instructions for answering the question, what is total sales alt? There they are right there. And there's my mistake. I'm summing up the price column, right? Well, I don't want to sum up the price column. I want to sum up the sale amount column, right? So now I changed, a few lines of code. It takes me just a second. When I hit enter, every single place I'm using that measure, suddenly it changes the way it's calculating to reflect the instructions. And now it's calculating it the correct way, which is what we want. I changed one line of code, I fixed everything. Very, very consistent, okay? Okay, good. So we've gone over the report author's definition. We've talked about the DAX novice definition. Before we get into the DAX developer definition, I need to discuss a concept with you so that you understand it a bit more, so that when I throw this word at you, you realize it's actually not all that scary. And that concept is a sub-expression. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, let's start with a recipe here, right? A little diversion. Let's say that I'm going to tell you how to make potato skins. I don't actually know how to make potato skins, or I do, but I just sort of made some of these things up. So if you try this and your potato skins are not super good, my apologies. Just go with me for a second. Let's imagine that this is a recipe for super good potato skins, right? To make super good potato skins, you do all this stuff. This is a boring old recipe. Okay, so within this recipe, I'd like to point out, if you follow all the instructions, the entire thing, you get potatoes, right? So that is a complete set of instructions. But within this set of instructions, there's also some sub-instructions, like this section right here. All of this relates to baking the potato, right? If I do all of these things, I end up with a baked potato. I don't have good potato skins yet. I have to rebake the potato with some toppings, but this subset of instructions still counts, right? So this is a subset of instructions that actually delivers the result. And furthermore, if I come to this little line down here, cut the potatoes in half lengthwise, well, even this is a complete set of instructions. It doesn't get me super good potato skins, but I can do this, right? And so the larger set of instructions for potato skins is made up of lots of little sort of underneath sets of instructions, or what we might call sub-instructions, or what we might also call sub-expressions, right? So in the world of DAX, an expression is just a set of instructions that returns a value. Now that value could be an entire table, it could just be a single number, but it's a set of instructions, right? So when you write a measure, when you type in the code, what you're typing in is the expression, right? How do I go perform these operations so that I get a number? And just like with the potato skins right here, right? In DAX, you can have sub-expressions. So if you've got a big long measure, within that measure, some smaller parts of it might be themselves instructions. So I guess what I'm getting at here is a sub-expression is just any set of instructions that are themselves part of a larger set of instructions, right? So usually the sub-expressions are themselves made up of even smaller sub-expressions, just like over here, where we've got bake the baked potato, right? This sub-expression from the larger super good potato skins expression, well, even it is made up of even smaller sub-expressions. If I come down here to rebake the potatoes, that's a sub-expression, which has sub-expressions underneath it, like these guys right here. And in these guys right here, even those guys have sub-expressions underneath it, right? So when you have a set of instructions, it will often contain sub-steps, which we are calling sub-expressions. Now, it's important to note that a sub-expression doesn't mean just any part of this code right here, if you want to think of it like code, any part of this recipe. It has to be sort of a complete step. In English, we might say that sentence fragments don't count. So if I were to say add the toppings, well, that counts as a sub-expression because you could do that. Add the does not, because it's an incomplete sentence. There's a similar concept in DAX. If I've got a sub-expression of 2, or I should say if I've got the code 2 plus 2, that counts as a sub-expression because I can do it. I can take the number 2 and add 2 to it. That could be a valid sub-expression. By contrast, 2 plus does not because, well, wait, plus what? This is an incomplete set of instructions. Okay, so again, a sub-expression, just any set of instructions that are themselves a part of a larger set of instructions. Okay, so armed with that, we can come back to our DAX developer definition, right? Measures evaluate a DAX sub-expression under a revised set of filters or filter context, right? So when we drag a measure into a visual, right? Well, like the results show up. So here for total sales by layout, we've got this measured total sales in there, okay? And here where we've got total sales by state and category, well, sure enough, the measure's right in there. How do these things work? Well, this is just like I showed you a minute ago, right? When we drag the measures into these visuals, it's going to change the summary query to reflect that, right? So when I add total sales in here, you're going to see in the summary query a line that says we're going to get all the different layouts, and for each layout we're going to get a calculation we call total sales, and to do it we're going to follow the instructions for total sales. And likewise, if we come down here where we've got total sales by state category, well, we've got this line right here where we say, hey, start by getting all the combinations of state and category, and once you're done doing that, add a column that we're going to call total sales and use the definition of the measure total sales to calculate it, okay? So when we say that a measure executes a DAX sub-expression, right, the sub-expression part is that this code right here for total sales, sum x, blah, 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 that's actually going to get executed both in this summary query and in this summary query. So those instructions get executed as a smaller set of this larger set of instructions, and here, this smaller set of this larger set of instructions, right? So this sub-expression gets sort of piped into both this query and this query, okay? Now, that part, I wouldn't say it's easy, but I bet if you look at this code, you say, I kind of get it. And you might be thinking to yourself, and I should say you'd be close, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, you know what? There where it says total sales, if I were just to replace that with this code right here, right, I would get the exact same result, because this measure is basically just a placeholder for this code. And you're close, but you're not quite there, right? That's half of it. That's the sub-expression part. But there's another part too about under revised set of filters. So let's see what happens if we were to do that. What would happen if we replace this reference to the measure total sales with the actual code that we typed in inside total sales? So if we were to do that, I do this simple swap out, right? I just take that code, sum x, blah, 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 and put it there where it used to say total sales, and put it there where it used to say total sales. And what you will get in that circumstance is not what you would expect. You will get the exact same number for every single cell, 64 million. Well, wait, why? What's going on? Why aren't the numbers different? The problem is this, right? For this particular cell right here, we need to make sure we have a filter for layout equals sit down. For this cell right here, we need a filter for layout equals walk up. For this cell right here, we need a filter for category equals beverage and state equals Washington. For this cell right here, we need a filter for category equals food and state equals Oregon, right? And those filters are not automatically there. Some piece of machinery has to add those filters, right? That piece of machinery is the measure. So in addition to running this sub-expression right here, when you call the measure, right, it changes the filters, right? It's going to modify the filters, create a new revised set of filters to include all of the categorical values of the current row. For this row right here, it'll add a filter for layout. For this row right here, it'll add filters for state equals Oregon and category equals beverage, right? Now, if you've been using DAX for a while, you might know another function that does something like this. And good job, you're a little ahead of the curve right here. If I actually wanted to, let's go back to our original right here, right? If I wanted to sort of create an equivalent statement by writing it out longhand, I wouldn't just swap out sum x for where it says total sales and total sales. I would swap it out, but I would wrap the whole thing inside of the calculate function, because the entire point of the calculate function is to revise the filter, just like a measure, right? So the calculate function, just like a measure, before it goes and runs this sub-expression right here, it's going to do it under a revised set of filters. So calculate says, I'm going to go perform these instructions, but before I do, I have to change the filters. Now, you can change it in several different ways, but the one way that you always change it is you add any categorical values to the current row as filters. So calculate adds a filter for layout equals sit down. Calculate adds a filter for state as Oregon and category equals beverage. And if I write it out sort of the original way, I get the exact same result, because that's what the measure does. The measure, in this case, total sales, is going to revise the filters, add all the filters for the current row, and then once it's added those filters, it's going to run these instructions under that new set of filters, right? By the way, the official name for this process of adding categorical values to the current row as filters is often referred to as context transition. Sometimes I call it current row filtering, same kind of idea. Okay, so that's probably the hardest part of this whole presentation is figuring that part out. that with a particular measure, right, it's not just that the measure houses the sub-expression. That's part of it, right? This set of instructions is going to get used in any number of summary queries. Yeah, that part's super duper important. But in addition, whenever you use it, because it's a measure, the very first thing it'll do is it'll revise the filters, right? So it's going to run the sub-expression under a revised set of filters. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pop over to the anatomy real quick. Hopefully, if you got that part, congratulations. That's by far the hardest part. You might also ask the question, well, wait a minute, aren't there a few other things inside of a measure, right? This is from the old ribbon, but I think you guys get the idea. If I were to click on a measure, right, if I click on, I don't know, total Martian right there, you'll see a bunch of stuff up here that says, hey, this is all part of a measure, right? So for a particular measure, yeah, you've got the measure name, you've got the sub-expression. You also have things like the display format and the data category and what table does the measure live in. And I don't want to say that stuff's unimportant because it's not. It's pretty important when you're designing a model for end users. You know, make sure that it formats correctly. Make sure that if it's a URL, you tag it as a URL. If there's, you know, you've got a table for measures, make sure the measure lives in that table. But from a DAX author's point of view, the things that you really have to focus on are the measure name. What question am I answering? The sub-expression. What are the instructions for answering that question? And the third hidden one, the filter revising behavior, right? It's going to be easy to remember this guy because you write it out, but you have to always remember in your head, before the measure executes, it's going to revise the filter. That's a critical part of the measure. So one of the nice things about it, if I pop over here to this slide, right? If you've got a measure in a visual, you always know two things, right? In terms of like, well, how did the measure get that number? It always gets it the exact same way. Some of the details are different. In fact, a lot of the details are different. But the same thing always happens. Whenever you call a measure, the measure revised the filters, and then it ran its sub-expression. So to get this number right here, well, that measure, total sales, revised the filters to add a filter for Camas, and then ran the sub-expression, whatever the heck that does right here. And that's true here in this cell. It's also true here in this cell. How did we get this number right here? The measure, total sales, right, revised the filters to add a filter for 2017 in Oregon, and then ran the sub-expression. That's true for every single place where you use a measure, right? No matter what. Okay, so that's what a measure is. You've got three solid definitions for it. I like to take just a minute, we're closing in on the end here, but I'll take just a minute to talk about implicit measures, or as I refer to them, the devil's workshop, right? If you take a numeric column and you drag it into a visual, by default, it will sum it up. So I've already done it here. Let me undo it just so you can see the process, right? So I'm going to go ahead and take sale amount here. So the total sales measure goes ahead and sums up the sale amount column. That's the instructions for it, right? So why don't I just take the sale amount column and just drag it right in there, right? If I do, notice it sums up that column very effectively. Why do I have to create a measure? Shouldn't I just be dragging columns in? The short answer is if you don't intend to get particularly good at DAX, or I should say you're maybe phrase it differently. If you're a casual Power BI user, you use it 2-3 hours a week, that's fine. Go ahead and do that. But if you want to understand DAX, you have to get away from that mentality. This is designed to make Power BI easy to use for end users who don't want to go through the process of learning DAX. But if you want to learn DAX, it's actually pretty darn important that you learn the concept that anytime you have a business question, you want to define it as a measure, right? One of the big problems with using these, what are actually called implicit measures, when you just drag a column into a visual, these often allow a report author to answer the same business question several different ways across a report. So if you decide you want to ignore my advice, you may remember me a little while from now when you have to spend your entire weekend fixing 200 visuals across 26 pages, one at a time, because you accidentally dragged in the base margin column instead of the adjusted margin column. When you do that, remember that I told you not to use these implicit measures, not at least until you master good old regular measures, right? I should say in practice, as a bit of a hint to people that are designing semantic models out there, once you design a measure like total sales that is summing up this sale amount column, good practice is go ahead and just hide that column, right? That way end users, I should say report authors, won't be tempted to just drag the column in. There's not two different ways of answering the same question. If you have a business question that's important enough to report on, like what is total sales, it's worth taking the time to define it as a measure, okay? And last but not least, the single most important part of this presentation, questions. Do you have questions? I bet that some of you do.
Oh, we got questions,
Got
Brian.
questions.
Don't you worry.
Okay.
All right.
Lay them on me.
Start from the top. So do both calculated columns and measures use DAX, or all the aggregation expressions DAX?
So yes. So if you do a calculated column, in fact, let me show you an example of that. I'm going to come over here. And I'm going to go to my, I'll go to my storage table because it's nice and small. I like that one. Okay, so in fact, let's go to, actually, I'm going to go to dim products. Maybe that one will be a little better. Okay, yeah, so let's say we've got this unit price. If I create a calculated column by right-clicking on the table and doing a new column, I can create a new column. Pretty easy. I'm going to call this my unit price forecast. This is what I expect the unit price to be a year from now. And like every good forecast, if you spend enough time, if you get a PhD in statistics, you're going to learn that you take the existing unit price, and of course you increase it by 10%. That's the best way to do a forecast. Don't actually do that in real life, but just so you can get a sense of sort of what we're talking about, right? I can add a column in any one of my tables using DAX, right? So if I add a calculated column like I did right here, this language right here is technically the DAX language, right? Now, this is not a measure. This is a calculated column. A measure is a business question. All we're doing here is adding a column to a table. So first off, that raises the question, well, wait a minute, should we add calculated column? I should say not calculated columns. Should we add a column using a calculated column like this? Or should I go to edit queries and do it over there? That could be an entire presentation into itself. My rule of thumb answer is if you have a choice, you should always do it in the edit queries button, because what we're talking about right here is fundamentally ETL. We're talking about preparing the data for summarization. The idea with these columns is we need a new column in our data model to support new kinds of summarization, right? And if that's the case, if you're preparing the actual tables themselves, that's what the ETL process is for. Now, two things. Number one, these calculated columns, they come from a time back when what we think of as DAX was part of Power Pivot, which was in Excel. And there was a time when you didn't have an edit queries button. So once you loaded data, if you wanted to add a column, this might be the only way to do it. So this is something else you could do with DAX, but it's not the primary job of DAX. It's not what it was built to do. It's just something ancillary you could do with it. There are a couple other uses for calculated columns, but the main one, by far the most important use of DAX, is to create summarizations. This thing where you add columns to tables, yeah, fine, you could do it, but it's not the point of it. You can even create pre-aggregated tables using the DAX language, which is fine, but that's not actually the purpose of the DAX language. That's just something else could do. The purpose of the DAX language is to take these physical tables, my dates table, my products table, my store table, my fact sales table, and quickly create summarizations of them, which Power BI can then draw as visuals, assuming that I could find an example here, like, you know, I don't know, this. Take that, drag it in there. That super duper quick summarization, that's why the DAX language exists, right? Okay, so I think I've answered that question. If I haven't, please let me know with a follow-up question.
Cool. Next question. Is it possible to edit the summary queries?
Well, I mean, no, but yes. So if the answer is
no, though, right?
What's that?
The answer is no.
The answer is no. So part of the idea with the DAX engine is I said before that DAX and Power BI are not the same thing, and they're not. They're good buddies. They're not the same thing. So other different client tools is what we would call them, can also send summary queries off to DAX, which DAX can then summarize. You can do it with things like Excel. Excel can connect to an analysis services engine, send off a DAX query, and then like get a result back. And you can also, you know, do even with things like Tableau. You know, I know I shouldn't even mention the word.
Don't you dare, Brian. Yeah. Don't you dare.
Yeah, I mean, so any number of client tools can send these queries off. And when they design these client tools, like with Power BI, one of the things they said is we don't want our end users or our report authors to have to learn this summary query language, because DAX by itself is already kind of difficult. If we ask people to write and modify the summary queries, forget it. And for one thing, like if I, let's see, where's my other old example? If I go back here, oh, I spent all this time writing the thing. The same goofy trick where I click on 2017 and it rewrites the code there. Yeah, okay. So notice when I drag a measure into a visual table like this, the initial summary query it writes is pretty simple. And you may say, oh, well, can I edit that? Well, assuming that you could for a second, imagine that an end user is going to be able to click on a slicer, and then it's going to have to get rewritten. And then they might click on some other slicer, and that gets rewritten. And they might click on 100 different things. And so it's actually almost impossible to think of all the different ways that a summary query could be written within a single user session. So that's the very long answer to the question. Can you write your own? The answer is no. I mean, you could scoop them up and drop them in a tool like DAX Studio, where you can then execute them and marvel at the results. You could even, if you're being kind of clever, if you take an Excel workbook and point it at a data model, a DAX engine, if you will, an analysis services model, or analyze in Excel. If you click on the little analyze in Excel button, you can actually modify the connection a little bit such that rather than connecting to it like a cube where you drag and drop like a pivot table, you can say, no, I want you to execute a DAX summary query, and the result gets returned to Excel. But that's Excel, not Power BI. So again, an even longer answer to your question, no, not really. All right.
Okay. Next
but
one.
You wouldn't really want to. You wouldn't really want to.
Gotcha. Next question I've seen a couple of times is, can you help people understand the interaction between the filters and the DAX query? I think people are getting confused that filters are part of the DAX query when really they just get passed through.
So yeah. Let me go. Let's see. I'm going to go pull up my original example so I think it's a little bit easier. Where'd you go? Here we go. So when I click on a slicer like this, right? The actual effect from Power BI's point of view is that when I click on it, Power BI says, oh, shoot, the visuals we have are no longer accurate. A second ago, like now, they were looking at all of the years, and now they're looking at 2017. In order to make the visuals just show 2017 data, I don't know anything about the data. Power BI has no idea what's in your data model. They have no clue, right? They have the metadata about what the different columns are, but they don't have the actual data itself. That question has to be answered by DAX, right? So when I click on 2017, Power BI can't tell me what the different data is, what the new numbers are. The DAX engine has to tell me that. So when I click on 2017, right, the way that actually happens is Power BI is smart enough to see that click and say, okay, now for every single visual, I'm going to have to go rewrite the summary query to include that filter, right? So, if I don't have any filters within this summary query, the summarize columns function, which is the function you use to create these summary queries, among others, that's the most important one. It's got a couple different sections. The first section is what I call the breakdown, where you list out all the columns that you want the combinations of. So here in the breakdown, we're going to say, show me every combination of city and category, which creates these columns right here, right? That's the first part of it, right? The third part of it, if you don't have any filters, the third part of it is, what are the different measure columns? What's the name of it, and how do I get it, right? That creates these columns right here. But in between those two is any filter
participant is now exiting.
Any filters you want to add in. So if I click on 2017, right, and I also click on beverage, right, what happens is Power BI says, okay, we need new summarizations that have filters for 2017 and beverage. So Power BI rewrites the summary query to include this middle section here, where we've got a filter for year is 2017, or is in this list of years is equal to 2017, and category is in this list right here of beverages, right? So because it adds these lines to the code, when DAX receives this summary query, this set of instructions for how to create the summary table, it says, okay, got it. They want a summarization. They want every combination of city and category. They want to add filters for years 2017, and category is beverage. And they also want to add these two measure columns. Total sales is the name of this one, and it uses these instructions right here. And margin percentage is the name of this one, and it uses these instructions right here. So every time you interact with the report, either by using slicers or by doing cross filtering, or even by using the filters pane, right? All that's happening, the only thing that's happening, is Power BI is smart enough to add those filters. Oh, wrong one. Got to do it for the version on the page. Power BI is smart enough to rewrite the summary query to add those filters so that DAX knows to add them when it creates the summary table. Does that sort of answer the question? How to do?
I think you did good. And we got one last one before we get towards wrapping up. This one's a little bit more advanced and it's a little unrelated. How do you keep track of your nested measures in a really complex model? Sometimes chains run several measures deep. I guess there's a tool out there called Ken Pulse's Monkey Tools, which was just released this week. There's an Excel add-on in Power Pivot in Power BI, which displays measures in a tree view so you can navigate up and down. Do you have any tips on that?
My tips are try not to make too many layers deep if you could avoid it. A lot of times I will see measures that are written that could be just as easily executed with either filters on the visual or filters on the page. Don't write new measures, just create the card or whatever it is and add your filters right there. Otherwise, in my experience, it's just practice. I haven't found a tool that works super duper well for me. In fairness, I've been doing this a long time, so like I'm pretty good at keeping all that stuff in my head. Yeah, I guess I don't really have a fantastic answer for that. Sometimes what I'll do is I will go ahead and scoop up the code of a particular measure. Like let's say I want to, let's say that I've got some measure. Oh, I don't know what it is. Let's imagine that. Oh, is this not a great example, but it's an okay example. No, it's worse. Let's say that I want to figure out what total sales. Let's say my margin percentage uses total sales, right? One thing I could do is just scoop up the entire code, go to my other measure, and then when I'm trying to figure out how stuff works, go figure out where the references to it are. Go ahead and paste that code in, and then do Control / to comment it out. That way you can actually see the measure inside of it, which isn't a fantastic answer. My real answer is just practice it for several years and you get really good, which isn't great. I haven't used those tools. They might be fantastic, but I guess I don't really have a great answer for that. Sorry about that.
I think maybe I know it's Jeff, and maybe he can do a presentation one of these times if he can stay up.
That's right.
So
Yeah,
I will pull him to that. Let's get one more. I know this is a quick one.
Sure.
Can you demonstrate how to pull like top end total sales across different combinations of cities and categories?
So if you want to, yeah, so I mean, okay, so let me go pop one open right here. Create a new page. There's the easy way to do it and the hard way. So I'm going to start by showing you the easy way, and I'm going to start and end by showing you the hard way. A, because we're running out of time, and B, it'd take a while. So let's say that I've got my different product names right here, right? And I'm going to summarize this by total sales. I'm going to increase the resolution of it so y'all can see it a little better. Let's bring you up to like 14. Come on. There we go. Okay, and let's say that our decision maker says, there's too many values there. I can't read them all. Just show me the top 3 or just show me the top 5. Let me simplify this even further still, right? I just want to see the top 5 of these. Well, that's pretty easy to do. The tricky part is to know where the buttons are and to know how to execute on that. So you have to ask yourself the question, for a particular visual, what am I taking the top of, right? So let's complicate this just a smidge. So we've got our product name, and let's also drag the product line on there, right? So if we want the top 3, well, wait a minute. What do we want the top 3 of? Do we want the top 3 products, or do we want the top 3 lines? Or we could even have something completely unrelated to the visual on there. Whatever it is, you have to figure out which one it is, right? So let's say that we want the top 3 product names, right? So click on the visual, go find product name and twirl it open, right? Now inside there, you can manually add filters, right? But here what you want to do is change the filter type from basic to top N, right? And you might think that you're done, or you might think, oh, I'm just going to type in top, what did I say, 5? and you stare at it for about 30 seconds, hoping something's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen yet because you have to tell it top 5 by what, right? Now you might say, well, wait, isn't it obvious total sales? Well, yeah, maybe it's obvious, but maybe you want to make it top 5 by margin percentage. In fact, let's do that, right? If I want the top 5 products by margin percentage, then I can take my margin percentage column and drag it here to where it says by value. And again, don't stare at the screen, hit the apply filters button. And when you do, you will get the top 5. Easy as that. Now, if you say, well, wait, I don't want it to be by margin percentage, I want it to be by total sales, we just drag total sales right in there, and you hit the apply button. It's as easy as that. The tricky part is remembering, wait, what is it by? You go find the thing, whether it's line or product name, you twirl it open, you select the filter type, the top end, you drop top or bottom and how many, and then be sure to drag in a measure there so it knows what to do it by. Okay, so that's a good question.
Yes, and I know I told you that last one, but let's do one more because I've gotten this a lot of times. How have you displayed the DAX on your report? You showed us how you were copying the query, adding to DAX Studio. Were you just using images, or can you speak to how you were showing like the DAX calculations in the report like that? Yes.
Slowly. So here's how you, not here's how you do it. Here's how I did it, right? This itself is just DAX, right? And I should say, it's kind of a parlor trick. It only handles these filters right here. So the way the measure works, for what it's worth, I bet some of you were hoping, oh, wait, is there a visual that I could download for that? No.
So it's not an image. This is not an image?
No, which is why if I click on one of these slicers, like beverage right there, it rewrites it. It's not, and I haven't used bookmark to do it, which is a good idea. But that's not.
I assumed that. Sorry.
No, that's fair. Let's see. I think I actually hid this measure. Let's go. Oh wait, no. KDAX. What is the DAX? So as you can see, well, as you can see, basically I just type in by hand this string right here, the ending, where I show the breakdown, show the combinations of city and category, and then the end where I say show total sales and use this, show margin trends, use that, and then I use some concatenate X's to go figure out what are all the different values that are filtered down to based on that slicer selection. And then I use some logic to say, well, wait, if there's nothing selected on slicers, don't add anything. But if there is, go ahead and get that list and then say, let's say it's years that people have selected. It adds this line right here where we've got 4 spaces, Jim dates year, in, open curly brace, and then whatever the years are, close curly brace. So it's a parlor trick to answer your question.
And will you be sharing this PBIX? I'm sure a bunch of people are going to want to see that.
Ooh, I will, but probably not yet because this is a preview of the class that I'm building. Stay tuned. We will have a class out where you should be able to see all of this stuff, and it's going to be fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah. Do you want to kind of like last minute plug on your DAX class that you have up your sleeve?
Yeah, so we're working on a sort of a new way to approach DAX. So this is part of it. This is sort of some of the early beginning parts of it. It's going to teach you how to think about DAX, maybe differently than you thought of it before. It's going to hopefully reduce the number of working parts in your mind that are used to think about DAX, which will sort of show you that the actual language itself is quite simple. There's only a few kinds of things that you could use. And using that small number of tools and patterns, you could build all kinds of fancy stuff. So that'll be coming online later. Yep.